Hello, and welcome to the World Built Environment Forum webinar series. We wish to thank Colliers International, the premier partner for the World Built Environment Forum. Thanks also to our executive partners, Glodon and Shanghai Oriental Investment Supervision Company. Today's topic is rethinking cities for aging populations. Now, according to the United Nations, a quarter of all people living in Europe and North America will be aged 65 or over by 2050. And if you are already in your mid-30s or older, then this means you. My name is John Krause, and it's my pleasure to welcome our international panel of industry experts. Firstly, Dr. Alison Pooley, who is Deputy Head of School for Architecture and Planning at the School of Engineering and the Built Environment at Anglia Ruskin University. Alison's current research focuses on forms of housing that address the future needs of society. Welcome, Alison. Also with us today is Julia Park, architect and head of housing research at Levitt Bernstein, whose work titled Age-Friendly Housing, Future Design for Older People is published by the Royal Institute of British Architects. Julia, good to have you with us.
Thank you, delighted to be here.
Thank you. And completing our panel is Dr. Jennifer Malinsky. Jennifer is a senior research associate at the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard University. She's also a lecturer at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. And one of the themes Jennifer has written about in this role is the role of housing in well-being in older age. Welcome to you, Jennifer.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Thank you. So that's our panel. And before we start, I should let everybody know that you can submit questions via the question box, and we will put those to the panel as we go along. And if not, we'll pick them up at the end of the conversation. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Julia to get us underway. So Julia, bearing in mind that older people are a very diverse group, how suitable is our current housing stock for an aging population?
Well, I think the short answer to that, particularly in the specifically in the UK, is not very suitable. 93% of current homes fail to meet current accessibility standards, which is not a good statistic. Clearly, we have we have greater problems with older stock, but we're not anywhere near where we should be with new build either. That's mainstream housing I'm talking about. In terms of specialised housing, I think it's getting a lot better. We have many more options, many more choices, many more types of accommodation are becoming available, but not in anywhere near the quantities we need.
Thank you. Do others want to come in on that point? Because we've heard that in the UK, there 93% of current housing is not really well suited to older people. Better story, of course, in the specialist housing. But what about elsewhere?
Well, this is Jen. In the United States, we are in a similar situation. Less than 4% of our housing stock is minimally accessible, by which I mean you could potentially get a wheelchair into the home, but that doesn't even account for things like the bathroom being accessible. Another issue that we have is that we not only lack the accessibility, but we lack the affordability. Currently, we've got 10 million older households, that's 65 and over, who are paying more than a third of their income on housing, and 5 million are paying more than half of that. And so in the United States, housing assistance is not an entitlement, it's not guaranteed, and only a third of those who qualify even get it. So we have this dual problem of accessibility and affordability for many, many people.
Thank you. That's a very good point about the affordability. That's one of the questions we're going to come back to later on. Do we have another view on this?
Yes, John. Hello. Thanks for having me. It's Alison Pooley here. Yeah, I was just going to reinforce really what Julia and Jen have already said. And and also think, I know that we're focusing on an aging population here, but think about resilience and adaptation more widely as well, particularly in terms of affordability, heat, fuel poverty, and those issues as well. So whilst we can address an aging population, obviously anything we do to address that also benefits wider society.
So a whole basket of issues there, which you're basically saying we can't look at the ageing society in isolation, but as we said at the beginning, there's a rather diverse group of people who have diverse needs. So Jennifer, we've heard there that the provision isn't great, to say the least. What are your views on how we can go about age-proofing housing?
Sure. So speaking just to the question of the physical home, the challenge, I think, is making homes more accessible and convenient to older people. We know that as a general rule, they have higher incidence of mobility difficulties, from things like climbing stairs to turning handles on doors or faucets, and also have a greater, for a variety of reasons, are more prone to falling. So, universal design solutions are, I think, where we want to go in that direction. What specifically is needed depends on where you are, and I'm sure this is not just an American issue, but our housing stock is older and more likely to be on multiple stories in the Northeast, compared to the West. So how do we get these features into homes? I think we need to be thinking about both the homes we have and the homes we build. In the United States, we have nearly 140 million housing units. We're building about 1 million a year. A typical unit can last generations. So, the existing stock, retrofitting that is a huge priority. We don't want to, at the same time, build things that are not accessible, but we do need to think about what we have. And I think the challenges are convincing people that they should retrofit for accessibility, particularly before they need it when they're doing other renovations, and that's not always easy. A second challenge is helping people afford that. And in the US, we have many cities and even some states that have loan and grant programs to help homeowners and landlords retrofit. But typically at this point, those are only when people have an actual disability and not in the case where we want to help people live more safely to prevent those disabilities. And just lastly, regarding the new stock, I think it's vital that we include these features from the start, and many local governments in the US require basic accessibility or adaptability features in new housing. So if you're not going to put in a grab bar, at least you reinforce the walls so that those can be done later. And these are called visitability ordinances. They're not as widespread as we would like, although the state of Vermont has actually adopted one for all of its new housing in the state. So we're moving in the right direction. It's just, there's just a lot when only 3.5% of your housing stock has the features that we're talking about.
Yeah, so a very good point there about effectively future-proofing property for people who are going to get older. Of course, things like reinforcing walls for grab bars is a great idea, but does the owner know that wall's been reinforced? The house changes hands. Does the new owner know it's been reinforced? There's all sorts of issues there around basically tracking the features that were within the building.
Right.
I'm going to ask the other panelists to come in on this. How do you see us going about age-proofing housing? Let me ask Alison first.
Yeah, well, all of the things that Jen has already mentioned, of course, we're attempting to implement in the UK and have gone some way to address some of those issues, particularly about accessibility, not only within the home, but outside of the home as well. So obviously, whilst we're looking at housing here, that's not, it's the wider city and the urban and the rural landscape that needs age-proofing too, to some extent. I think the issue of appropriate and adaptive housing is critical in terms of the physicality of the home, but also thinking about how can we use technology to enable living longer at home, or just making people feel more connected to the community as well, because there's the physical constraints of being within an age inappropriate home, but also the isolation that that residents can feel for not being able to leave necessarily. So I think that those wider issues need to always be considered too.
Thank you, Alison. So, Julia, can I bring you in there? There was mention of technology. Do you have thoughts on the technology side of this challenge?
I do. If I may, I'd just like to mention where we are in terms of, in policy terms, in the UK. We've had a basic accessibility standard within building regulations, Part M, for a number of years now, but it really is a basic standard. But in 2015, we added 2 higher tiers to the building regulations. They're called optional requirements, all rather clunky language, but basically there's a version of lifetime homes now in building regulations. And the wheelchair standard 2, that's the highest of the 3. And they are available to local authorities to prescribe in the proportions they think they need those 2 upper levels, if you see what I mean. So the age-friendly one, the lifetime homes one, they might say 50% of new housing has to meet that standard. Might be 90%, it is in London. And in London, the remaining 10% has to meet wheelchair housing standards. So we know what to do when it comes to new housing. We haven't, as I say, it's fairly recent, but we're certainly working to it now. And I think we frankly just have to get on with it. The middle tier doesn't cost much more than the basic level, really, in real terms, and it's just so much more practical. And we need to bear in mind, of course, that older people need to visit other people. So it's not just the homes of older people that need to be age friendly. It's all new homes, and I think there's very little excuse now for not doing that. So I'd really like to see, either every authority jump on the bandwagon and go for much higher percentages, or preferably make the current middle age friendly standard the minimum standard, just and get rid of the basic standard. And indeed, that Part M is being reviewed at the moment, and I'm moderately hopeful that might happen. For older housing, we make bespoke alterations, and they can be funded by the Disabilities Facilities Grant, which helps a bit. And I think in those scenarios, it's very helpful to have an architect on board working with an occupational therapist, so that somebody is very clued up about the kind of alterations that would help the person or people in question. But an architect is there to spot possibilities and good ways of achieving that, and aware of what's possible and what's not possible in terms of drainage connections and so on. So everything's as practical as it can be. And just going back to one other point we've talked about, which is about more thinking about retrofitting more broadly. Of course, we face a massive climate challenge at the moment, and that is likely to mean substantial work to most older homes. And it does seem to me a very opportune moment to think about how we can make those homes more age friendly at the same time. And looking out of my window, possibly a bit more flood proof too. But you asked me about technology. I'm sure we'll come back to this, but it is a big part of the future, I think, and incredible what we can already do. You can get contact lenses that test the blood sugar in the tears in your eyes. You can get devices to put in your toilet which test your pee every morning and will report to someone and let them know it's okay if that's what you choose to do. You can get cameras that detect a change in walking gait, which is an early indication of a stroke. And while quite a lot of that might feel a little bit scary to today's older people, tomorrow's older people will have grown up with digital technology and be pretty comfortable with it, I think. But of course, there are huge ethical issues associated with it, and nothing is necessarily straightforward.
Thank you. There's a whole basket of issues there. I'm sure we will come back to the issues around standards and planning in a later question, and the need for professional expertise, whether it's architects or occupational therapists, and understanding the connectivity with wider issues. Just the physical stuff like fitting in with drainage and that sort of thing, but also the wider issues like how do you take the opportunity to retrofit a building for climate change, but at the same time think about these other aspects. So for the next question, I'd like to bring in Alison's experience in the fields of environmental equity and resilience in the community. Alison, what are the consequences for individuals and society of us not meeting the needs of an aging population?
Well, I think we're experiencing the consequences of that now. You know, I know we're going to get onto some of these issues later, but the inadequacies of existing housing, as we've already touched on, the need to future-proof new housing, where legislation has been lagging, as it has been with environmental responsive buildings as well. So policies lagging rather than leading on both of those issues, as Julia highlighted. I think the other thing we need to think about is thinking holistically, that we can't separate the impact of not aging well and not aging better. So people may well be aging in place, but that doesn't necessarily mean aging in place is liberating and happy. So we have to ensure that people are aging in place rather than trapped in place, I think. And of course, the consequences of aging well on health, on the health sector, on the NHS in the UK. I'm sure Jen will have something to say about the situation in the US, and the potential amounts of money that can be saved through people aging well and having good places and decent homes to live in. And that's where the lifetime homes policies, of course, are so critical. There are the broader challenges of not facing the consequences of this. Of course, we're reaping them now and have done for several years in terms of not addressing the environmental imperative, in terms of very basic things like just insulating houses better. And I think Julia is completely right. We're just about to miss a trick if we don't act soon in terms of rolling in that retrofitting for environmental performance with retrofitting for age resilience, or older people occupancy performance, for want of a better expression. I think
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's very clear. And I think I read somewhere that the Building Research Establishment, I think back in 2016, had given an estimate of the cost of poor housing to the UK's National Health Service, somewhere in the region of £624 million a year. So clearly, failure to invest in quality housing hits the health budget eventually. Jennifer, your reference there by Alison's comments, how does this look from an American perspective?
I think very similarly in terms of the health consequences and the cost to the healthcare system. And as I'm sure you know, we're deeply invested in conversations about the future of healthcare in the United States. But thinking about the kinds of impacts that will have if we are prematurely institutionalizing people, putting people moving to nursing homes because their housing, the services that go to housing, or the physical house itself is not suitable for older people. I think that the ethics lens is a really useful one, and I have seen some really great work beginning to be done about what does an aging society look like, and what is beyond the hospital, beyond end of life care, bioethics. So the Hastings Center for Bioethics in the US has done some wonderful work on this question. And I think that there's, an ethical, even democratic aspect to this too. I mean, if we're, as a society, letting millions of households live in unsuitable conditions, and if our public infrastructure, I mean, we've talked about housing, but I'm thinking also of our transit and our streets and our sidewalk, if they're not amenable to an older population, I think that we will see less of that population, that older people become less visible in society. And I think that has real democratic implications. So, as this older population grows, and we're looking at in the next 20 years, a third of our households being 65 or over, what kind of society do we want to live in, and how do we want to include everyone? So I think, the questions, the implications really draw upon everything from economics to sort of, the whole structure of the democracy, frankly.
John, if I could just come back.
Yes, do please.
Back in on that. One of the key issues here, I think, when we're thinking about aging populations and older people, that we need to always view them, or us actually, as a resource. It's rather than the problem. And I think too often in the conversations that we have around the criticality around an aging population, that we tend to focus on the notion of burden, or rather than resource. And I think that's something that we need to keep in mind too, that we are, as Jen said, potentially cutting ourselves off from a huge resource and a huge learning opportunity by too early not allowing people to take part in wider society. And as Jen said, looking at transportation and issues outside of the home as well. Of course, and I just wanted to say that those NHS statistics are obviously picking up issues of housing generally, which, for all ages.
Thank you. And I think we'll come back again to some of those points with a later question on what we can do at the local authority and city level. Just want to move on to the next question, and it actually picks up one that's coming from one of our participants today who's listening in. So the next question it's aimed at Alison, and it's about really asking what are the barriers for older people moving to more suitable housing, and what can we do about them? But also a question from Thomas Elsmore online, who says, what are your top 3 tips for a developer to introduce into new homes that can help an aging population? So 2 questions together there, but essentially let's have some practical tips for what we can do that developers can contribute. So that one is for Alison.
Okay, so the barrier. Do you want me to answer the barriers first, or the top 3 tips?
Do both in whichever order you feel.
Okay, I might do the barriers first, so it gives me a bit longer to think about the top 3. So I mean, I guess the barriers for me would be affordability, accessibility, supply, and location. So particularly in the UK, there's an overemphasis on policy, on owner occupation. Every man's home is his castle. The commodification of home over, particularly since the 80s, has been very detrimental on social housing. Different kind of tax treatment for different tenures, and of course then viewing home as commodity, there's potentially divergent interests when older people come to move in terms of wealth, because they're, housing. We have an expression, bricks rich, cash poor. So, older people may have a lot of wealth, but it's tied up in their housing, which may make them reluctant to move. And then there's also obviously decisions about downsizing and wider pressures from the family, and that talks back to issues of location. There just aren't enough appropriate homes for people to move into, and I think that's where the research I've been doing most recently with Jenny Panel, which is going to be in a forthcoming RICS report, actually due out in March. So looking at almshouses and other tenure types and other routes to construction as well that aren't just commercial and aren't strictly privately funded or socially funded, so more of a philanthropic model. So that would be a top tip for me for a developer, is to always look at, not necessarily a top tip for inside the home, but a top tip for providing homes, is to always roll in affordable, truly affordable, and I'm sure we'll come back to the contentious issue of affordable housing, a tenure, and particularly look at possibly at almshouses, and work with your local authority in providing age-appropriate housing, adapted housing, inclusive housing, and inclusive design on anything that you're developing, both inside and outside the home.
Thank you very much, Alison. Julia, I wonder, do you have a couple of tips for developers?
I think a lot more older people say they're interested in moving. Well, I know a lot more say they're interested in moving than actually do move. So I think there's a bit of our head saying one thing and our heart saying another. And I think that's largely been because the housing options for older people, the specialised housing options, haven't been very inspiring until quite recently. It's felt like a step down, a step back, not a step forward in terms of not exactly status, but you know what I mean. It's been something we've had to accept, that the time has come, and so we must go into sheltered housing or extra care or retirement living, and only recently have we seen examples of those types of housing and many more actually that actually are nicer than the homes that many of us are living in, or certainly much better than was previously on offer. So I think there's been a sort of chicken and egg. There still is a chicken and egg thing going on, because the market still isn't very big, because we still don't have very many of the very nice specialised homes that we know are possible. They're certainly coming through, but not in enough quantities to make that the normal thing to do, if you see what I mean. So I think it has started. I think it will improve. I think most older people now have seen or been aware of options which are really lovely, and they can. I mean, like me, I've seen plenty in the last 10 years since the Happy Report, really, that I could genuinely imagine myself living in, not just my parents or my grandparents, but get quite excited myself. And that's really where we want to get to. I think developers have responsibilities to do better with all housing. We've sort of talked about that a bit, but I don't. It would be nice to think developers would choose to make our homes a bit more age-friendly, even when the local authority doesn't insist that they do. But more broadly, I hope there'll be a kind of growing confidence that there is a market out there, or indeed many markets, and until people start to see places they'd like to live in significant quantities, we're not really going to get that sort of breakthrough point. So everyone has a role to play, I think.
Yeah, and one of the questions that's come through and just listening to what you're talking about is a follow-up question really from Thomas. And do you have any specific examples that we're talking about, this idea that there are places there that people should feel excited about moving into rather than resigned to moving into? Can you give us a couple of examples of what you would regard as good practice?
Yes, I mean, we are a huge cohort, aren't we, of people? So whereas I used to think it's all rather confusing, these different names, and retirement living and extra care and sheltered housing and dementia facilities, how does anyone choose? I still think it's quite confusing, but the more I think about it, the more I think that choice is essential. And when I was researching for the book I wrote with Jeremy Porteous, we found just lovely examples of all types of housing, specialised housing in this country now. New examples. I think if I could sort of pick out any themes among the best ones, I think that in the UK we're not really in the market for huge retirement developments. I think there's more of an appetite to stay integrated in terms of age and multi-generational settings. I think previous examples have tended to be very institutional, quite practical and quite safe, but either sort of chintzy, which is a bit of a stereotype. There's absolutely no reason why older people wouldn't enjoy very modern interiors, and indeed they really do very often. So I think we've busted some stereotypes as well along the way. But I think this idea of being relatively small and therefore non-institutional is quite important. But if I had to pick one case study from the book, from the examples we looked at in the book, it would have to be the New Ground in High Barnet, the older women's cooperative co-living development, which you probably saw on the television, many of you. It's only 26 flats. It's in Barnet. It was founded by Maria Brenton, who formed a small group. Took ages to come to fruition. And in fact, only one of the original members who had this idea, these women who decided they would like to live together, only one of them actually managed to move in for various reasons by the time it was built. But it's caused a media storm. 4 million people, I think, downloaded the broadcast of Moving In Day, and I think it was 400 people that applied that same night to join them. And unfortunately, they're all full. But I think it's really interesting that, but in many ways not surprising that we mind a lot about who we're going to be living with if we choose to take that step, and make a move, because we don't want to live alone. It feels, and the more I think about it, the more obvious it is that of course we're going to mind, aren't we? It's not just about where you live. You're very likely. I mean, it's intuitive that you would like to live with people you think you could get on with, and the bonuses that come from that are potentially enormous.
We've got some more questions coming in following on from those remarks, and so I want to move us to the next question, which is, as we phrased it on the slide, it's about what should we do to increase the supply of housing designed for older people, which is really driving at issues such as planning policy and the practice of local planning departments and authorities. We have a related question from King Lam Chang, who says he's joining us from Hong Kong, and he's saying that there's lots of people needing housing in Hong Kong. Often the property is very old, unaffordable, and too small. So what regulations can be brought in to address those kinds of issues? So I'd invite the panelists to come in. Who wants to come in on this? So planning policy, regulations, who would like to contribute to that?
I can jump in just from an American perspective. I probably can't address the question about Hong Kong, but in the U.S., development is very much a local thing, and building more densely is very contentious. And so one of our challenges is that most older people are aging in low density places. So how do we allow more density in the communities where people are? I mean, this gets to a larger question, just a very brief little sidetrack here on aging in place, which I think is a very ill-defined term. And we're kind of obsessed with this term here about aging in place. And for some people, it means not leaving your actual house. And for some people, it means not leaving your actual community. And so one thing that I think that we need is more pressure on the smaller communities, the lower density communities, to allow more development in those places where older people live, so that they don't have to leave their community, although they may leave their house. And I do think, back to the previous question, there's a role for the development community here in helping to make that case and showing the attractive options that people have. Because one thing is, if you ask people if they want to, how strongly they feel about leaving their current house, it really depends on what options are out there that they may not even have thought of yet. So all that said, I think that one thing we need to do is to really allow greater density in the village or the suburban downtown centers, and that typically is going to require quite a campaign to allow that to happen in the United States. We're seeing a little bit of traction on it, but that's where our big challenge is. And then to allow that that housing to be built with supportive services embedded in it. We're seeing more and more housing that is being built with some services, not healthcare services, but some supports, which I think are really useful. But again, this is sort of, I think, partly a regulatory problem, and also partly a marketing, education, kind of communication issue that we need to get the word out about these possibilities for people who aren't aware of them.
Thank you. And we've also got a question from Christina Rativa, who asks about the commercial infrastructures as she describes them. Do we have commercial infrastructures that are better suited to meeting the needs for an aging population's residential properties, or is there a danger that there's some complacency in the market? So, good question there. Do we have the commercial models that are going to work? I suppose one might extend that to issues such as Section 106, community infrastructure levies, kind of legal agreements between planning applicants and the local authorities to mitigate the impact of a new home. What about the sort of this commercial financial aspect? How can we make the most progress on that? Who would like to come in on that?
I could comment briefly on that, and I'd just like to pick up just on what Julia was saying, and offer an example as well, because it sort of talks to the commercialisation issue. Of the example that I'd give is Cannock Mill, partly because it's in Essex, so quite near our university, and that's a co-housing project again, led by residents and with Anne Thorne Architects. So that's, if people want to look that up, they have a very extensive website. And just going back to the example of almshouses and commercial models, I think there are alternative commercial models there, and some of that infrastructure does already exist, as you said, through levies, through the infrastructure levy, but also through other funding models, whether that's a charity bank or Homes England grant funding or other grant grant funding, because out of the new arms houses that have been built over the last 10 years, and it's by no means going to address the problem fully, and arms houses aren't just for older people, but they are affordable in perpetuity. So only 40% of the new arms houses built in the last 10 years didn't have recourse to public funding, so they were looking at other models. So I think there are people out there wanting to supply appropriate housing and looking at alternative models. So I think we should be heartened by that, and that should be encouraged. And I think it's a great shame that the community-led housing fund will be coming to an end in the UK, of course.
Thank you. Let's move on. I'm conscious of time and conscious of questions coming in from people listening. So I want to move on to the next question, which is for Jennifer. And we touched on the aging in place. What does that mean? So give us some practical tips for how best to support those who wish to remain specifically in their own home, not just their own community, but their own home. Well, what are the, I guess it's technology, it's adaptations. Well, what are the things which have most impact in this?
Well, I think it's a kind of combination of some of the things we've talked before. The modification question, I think doing that early, doing that before people have need, doing that with assistance, from an architect and occupational therapist. I think we have a plethora of guides out there that can help you walk through your own home, although sometimes it is hard to see your home with, fresh eyes in that way. I think one of the benefits of technology that we didn't really talk about is the way it can take the place of some of the physical modifications that we've been, talking about the last few years. So things like moving light switches or outlets or thermostats to within reach of a wheelchair. Now we can do a lot of that from our phones. So I think there's a lot of promise for the technology. I think we really do need to think about how we can help people pay for these things. We have the bricks rich, house poor. I hadn't heard, but we do say house rich, cash poor. So that similar idea that most people's money is tied up in their homes if they're a homeowner, and then for renters, that's another issue as well. And then the other thing I think we really need to think about, and people who are deciding to age in place need to think about, is if their community can support them. So is it a place where there's transportation, that if they choose not to drive or can't drive anymore, are there services? Are there ways to stay engaged, so that we don't want to be a nation of people who are aging in place but shut in their homes? So how can we, how can people think about that? Unfortunately, I think there's an aspect of planning ahead, but there's also a need for us all to be good advocates for these things at the local at the local level, just because there's such tremendous need, and we need to get these things in place. So, how can we make visits by home health aides or other supportive services more efficient? How can people pay for those? So these are all questions I think it's wise to be thinking about ahead of time for individuals, but they're also real policy concerns as well.
Julia, I wonder what your thoughts would be on this one.
Well, slightly going back to the previous question, I do think there are quite a lot of incentives which could help older people make wiser choices, as well as stay at home if that's what they still decide to do. And we know in this country all the help basically is aimed at first-time buyers at the moment, isn't it? And has been for some time. So stamp duty exemption, for example, or why not extend that to older people who downsize, for example? Help to Buy is all aimed at first-time buyers, and it's only available when you buy a new home. Well, new homes are more accessible than older homes, so why not encourage youngsters to buy older stock and and leave more of the newer stock for older people, for example. But I also think that many older people would live better lives in more appropriate accommodation if it was available and if they were willing to give it a try. So some developments do offer trial periods, for example, which is helpful. But I think we all have to be realistic about whether we want to be still clearing out our gutters and you know, at 85, and if not, who's going to do it for us? All the stuff that goes with maintaining a house in particular gets more and more difficult as you get older, and I would like all older people or everyone actually just to sort of think through the possibilities of a different kind of home and how liberating that might be. And of course, you know, the next cohort of older people, many of those, probably most of those, will have experienced living in a flat at some time in their lives, whereas possibly the current cohort of older people haven't. I'm one of those people who's only ever lived in a house, actually. So working up to moving to an apartment, which I think is going to be the most sensible and in many ways the most liberating move, has been quite a challenge. But I think I'm nearly there, and I think it potentially, as I say, is liberating. And of course, the other thing about an apartment is that you know there are always people around you if you want company.
Thank you. And this leads us nicely into the question of, you know, what you can do at the sort of community level. So Puni Liali, for example, has asked a question online about what are the options for smart cities? What can they do to help with this issue? And I think also we've mentioned things like policies and practices. So, for example, I know that in France there are schemes whereby older people cohabit with a younger person, and there are mutual benefits from that. Or in Brazil, aging in place practices in some of the big cities there, where you have apartment porters who are trained in looking out for the needs of older residents. So, you know, quite a lot can be done at the community and city level. So, Alison, from your point of view, what do you see as a couple of examples of good practice within cities?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, we can sort of do worse than look towards the Netherlands for some really good examples. In our research in the last year, we were looking at examples from both the Netherlands and the UK. And there was a particularly nice example in the Netherlands from Patrimonium Housing Association. It was in Veenendaal, which is near Utrecht, and it's a development called Sanssouci, and it's a very collaborative design in terms of a mixed tenure. So this is where mixed tenure and intergenerational, and I think, you know, this is something that's really coming to the fore, looking back to going forward really, and addressing intergenerational housing. So in Sanssouci there was housing, a four-sided courtyard, 3 stories, included co-housing, renting, housing for people who had other learning abilities, and there were also services at ground floor level that included a dentist and a surgery. So that felt, and it was in a new development, so a new community development, and that felt a very holistic approach. So that was a very good initiative. And then, of course, thinking again in the Netherlands, I'm sure we've all seen the example of Jurien Mentkens, who you know, and the 5 students that live in a care home. He's also done a TEDx talk. So there are those initiatives, and of course, as we've discussed always been evident throughout this discussion, there's no one silver bullet, there's no one answer to any of this. We're talking about a very varied cohort, as we established from the beginning. The old, the young old, those people who are still working well into their 70s, those people who may be retired at 50 with a lot more time on their hands. So the initiatives and the responses have to be varied as well. And I think one of the key issues really is about empowering community, which sort of picks up some of the issues earlier. It's one of the 5 priorities from the Centre for Ageing Better as well. So going back to thinking about the question from Hong Kong that I'm not sure I ever got around to answering, but I'm not particularly sure how to answer other than that if we can find ways of empowering community, whether that's through levies, economically, collectively gathering, then that has to be a good way, because that is how those 2 examples that Julia and I have already highlighted, through those empowered communities, that's how that housing got built.
Thank you. So I'm conscious of time. I'm going to move on to the very last question. I'm going to put this question to all of the panelists, which is really, from a city planning perspective, what are the key considerations? So let me perhaps rephrase that along the lines of, if you had 3 things that you would recommend maximum that we should do from a city planning perspective, what are those 3, the 3, not silver bullets, there's no silver bullet, but three initiatives you would recommend city leaders take? So let me ask maybe Julia first on that one.
Well, I think the obvious one has to be a barrier-free environment insofar as that's possible. So, for example, London has a number of, quite a lot of the buses and tube lines have step-free access, which is incredibly welcome. They're working through the rest, but the difference that makes is enormous, particularly to a wheelchair user, but even to an older person. I actually got off a tube last week, and it was my carriage stopped on a slight bend, and I was absolutely horrified at the size of the gap. It really took me by surprise, and luckily there was a guy on the platform warning people. I mean, it was probably a third of a metre across almost. So very practical things like that matter. Simple things like more public toilets. A lot of older people say one of the reasons they're reluctant to go out is in case they can't find a toilet in time, and it's very difficult these days. So it was quite nice to see the London plan incorporate that requirement this time around. What else have I got? Another simple thing, longer crossing times when you're crossing the road, with an audible message as well. You don't get very long often to cross the road, and that can be very off-putting and worrying for older people. But generally, I think our bigger cities are pretty good, and that probably reflects greater investment. So in some ways, I think towns, smaller towns possibly have more work to do.
Thank you. Jennifer, what 3 would you see from looking at from the United States? What are 3 things?
The first, I would wholeheartedly agree with a barrier-free environment, and I think that means looking at complete streets, which are going to work for everyone, the transits, accessibility and suitability for older adults. The second, I would say, is allowing more housing options, especially in our smaller towns. We have to get away from being a single family or small apartments or what have you. But there's, as was said earlier, there's not one size fits all here. We need a whole range of housing options that can work for older people, and we have to allow those to be built. And the third, I would say, is that in any of these efforts, we really need to be working with older people, engaging people. We can't plan for, we need to plan with. And I'm reminded of this story that I heard once from the New York City Commissioner of Parks, talking to a group of older people at a senior center, and it was across the street from a park, and the older people told him that they never used the park, and he said, why? And they said, well, because there's a sign on it that says no adults are allowed without children, because part of the place was a playground, and they wanted it to be, safe for kids. So it was a matter of moving that sign to just the playground area in order to make people feel welcome into that space. So they're very simple things, but if we don't engage with the population, that we're trying to address, it can, we're going to take a lot longer to get there.
Thank you. It is striking how many of these are just small things which could easily be addressed. I just got a couple of comments in online. L. Piercy has said we should remember protecting conservation areas as being an important part of making the environment feel welcoming for people. And Lisa Dunshea in New Zealand has flagged up work done by Auckland Council and shared a web link which we will include in the write-up to this report. So I'm giving the final word then to Alison. Your three wishes, what would they be?
Pretty similar to Julia and Jen's actually. I had Wayfinding as well, which picks up on the inclusive design. So looking at inclusive design more broadly, Wayfinding would be part of that. Places to sit, places to meet, and I also think the focus on cities, whilst very significant because of course the majority of the population will be living in cities, it's really important not to forget those people that will still be living in a rural location. So and that goes back to the question from one of the participants earlier about smart cities and how we can be living smarter. So thinking about smart transport infrastructure would be that joins cities to towns and villages would be an issue, I think, for me.
Thank you. I love that idea of a smart city being smart enough to remember the areas around it, the smaller towns and the rural hinterland, and how they all interact. So thank you. That's all we have time for today. Many thanks to our international panel of experts, Dr. Alison Pooley of Anglia Ruskin University, Julia Park of Levitt Bernstein, and Dr. Jennifer Molinsky at Harvard. Thanks once again to our premier partner for the forum, Colliers International, and to our executive partners, Glodon and SOIS. Do let us know if you're listening what you thought of the webinar by completing the online poll that will be appearing on your screen in just a moment. Thank you very much for listening. We will write up this report and we will make it available on our website just as soon as we can. Thank you very much indeed, and goodbye.